Hello everyone and welcome to our channel, Dr. Hamzah Alkinani. This is the weekly political dialogue. Welcome to a new interesting interview today, the USA and the balance of power in the Middle East, with a very interesting guest. I am honored today to introduce the brilliant author, political philosopher, powerful lecturer, and multi-talented scholar with honor degrees from so many universities in the planet. He has been called by the New York Times arguably the most important intellectual alive, and he is among the 8 most cited scholars in history. I could go on for hours and hours introducing our distinguished guest, who in fact doesn't need any introduction. But my dears, welcome with me the one and only Professor Noam Chomsky. Welcome, Mr. Chomsky.
Very pleased to be with you.
We will start this conversation with a summary of our guest's new book. Then we will talk about Afghanistan, Russia, China, and Taiwan. After that, we will go to our main topic, questions related to the Middle East. At the outset, we would like to congratulate you, Mr. Chomsky, on the release of your new book with Vijay Prashad, which is related to our discussion today. The withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the fragility of US power. Can you give us a short summary of your new book, and we can go from there?
Yes, it's pretty much indicated by the title. We went through the recent U.S. major interventions in the Central Asia, Middle East, MENA, North Africa region, described their failure to achieve major goals and the implications of all of this for the New World Order that is arising. This was too early to take into account the Ukraine war, which is also having a major effect on how the world is reorganizing in the wake of these various, I would say, disasters, probably with more to come, maybe more serious ones. Our general conclusion is that, while US power has suffered some setbacks, still remains the overwhelming dominant power in the world. Ukraine war in many ways has made it even more so by subordinating Europe even more deeply within the US-dominated Atlanticist NATO framework. Meanwhile, other forces in the world are moving in the opposite direction, as a number of poles of power are consolidating. Major one, of course, around China, with its enormous economic expansion through the Belt and Road Initiative based on the China Cooperation Organization, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, extending over much of Eurasia, beginning to penetrate even to Europe with a new announced huge investment in Hungary, Chinese investment of supposedly in world's biggest battery plant, expanding into Africa, Latin America, U.S. trying to counter it in various ways. The recent NATO summit, NATO, of course, means U.S. basically. The recent NATO summit, for the first time, extended the reach of NATO formally to the entire world, to the Indo-Pacific region, meaning basically the world. That's the Atlantic, the Indo-Pacific. And this is all part of the encirclement of China, major project, U.S. effort to prevent Chinese economic, technological development and economic expansion over the world. These are the major poles of emerging power. There are many other complexities.
Sorry, Mr. Chomsky, sorry to interrupt, but what about third world countries such as India, Indonesia, and other? Do they have any consolidations?
The third world, former third world, the global south, is itself consolidating in interesting ways. India, Indonesia, Malaysia, other major countries of South Africa are not cooperating in the U.S. NATO Atlanticist project. They're staying remote from the Ukraine war. They're keeping their connections and ties with both sides.
So, Mr. Chomsky, the crucial question here is, will Turkey move?
Technically a member of NATO, but increasingly strengthening its relations with Russia, with India, with China, could possibly even join the BRICS system. Brazil, Russia, India, now Indonesia, China, South Africa, could be an independent force in world affairs. The outcome of the Brazilian election will affect this. If Lula wins the second round, he will probably invigorate BRICS the way he did during his first term in office when it became a significant independent force in the world.
All of these things are developing a base in conflict with one another. There are many points of tension and conflict. One of them, which is not discussed much, but might turn out quite significant. It is over Cyprus. Can you talk to that, please?
Turkey and India have common interests with Russia. Russia has even suggested a possible Moscow to northern Cyprus, the Turkish area, to flights. The United States isn't strongly opposed to this. In fact, is moving to try to integrate the Republic of Cyprus, the Greek-based part of Cyprus, more closely into the, not just European Union, but into the NATO alliance, new arms sales and so on. A lot of this has to do with energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean, who will have control and access to them. So all of these developments are taking place in a complex reshuffling of world order, with the United States trying very hard to maintain its world dominant role that it's held since the Second World War, when it replaced Britain as the basically hegemonic world power with a reach far expanding beyond Britain. So those are the kinds of topics that we try to take a look at. They've developed since in ways that we didn't cover and are developing rapidly now in complex ways, which will have enormous consequences.
Why is the policy of the United States criticized, which naturally would do anything in the world of politics to maintain its hegemony? Is it not expected of China, Russia, or any other country to do worse if they are in the place of the United States today?
Well, Russia is not actually a competitor in this game. Its economy is about the size of Mexico. It's very rich in mineral resources, not just oil and not just fossil fuels. So the German-based industrial system that's developed in Europe can provide the technology, the investment, and needs the mineral resources that Russia has in abundance. So one major question in world affairs is whether Germany, which is the economic industrial powerhouse of Europe with a system extending from the Netherlands to Slovakia, whether the German-based system will be willing to hang on to Washington's coattails and enter into serious decline, maybe permanent decline, or whether it will move towards some kind of accommodation with its very natural partner in the East. But with regard to your question, certainly there's no expectation that if any other country, the only imaginable one now is China, ascended to world power, that its policy would be any better than the United States. But nobody's advocating that. The alternative to US unilateral domination is a multipolar society. It's quite a different phenomenon. It means many centers of power.
Sorry, Professor Chomsky, again. You talk about the multipolar society. Do you have any examples in your mind for its forms, please?
There are many forms in which this could take. One, which in my personal view is a positive, optimistic one, would be something like Mikhail Gorbachev's vision at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. What he called for at the time was moving towards what he called a common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok, no military alliances, co-equals, no victors, no defeated, Europe and the Russia-based system moving in partnership towards a social democratic future.
Can that still be reconstructed if there is any disruption on the Ukraine war?
It's not impossible, I don't think, because it's a very natural partnership. The Gorbachev vision was not original. It grew out of long-term tendencies during the Cold War, associated primarily with Charles de Gaulle, who called for an independent Europe, a third force in international affairs. He spoke of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. Gorbachev expanded it to all of Europe in a broad sense, including Russia. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik in Germany, some of Olof Palme's initiatives were also pointed in that direction. The US was, of course, always strongly opposed. It wanted to press for the Atlanticist vision based on NATO, which means US dominance. Actually, Vladimir Putin gave an enormous gift to the United States. He handed Europe to the United States on a silver platter. Best gift that Washington could want. Worst outcome from Russia's point of view. So apart from the criminal aggression, was also criminal stupidity from the point of view of Russia's interests. And it severely disrupted, for the moment at least, the natural evolution towards an accommodation in the Eurasian landmass. Of course, we cannot overlook the fact that China, the other end of Eurasia, is expanding rapidly. Its economic system is expanding rapidly through all of Eurasia. The Belt and Road Initiative, as I mentioned, it's even extended by now into Hungary. It's an entry into Europe. Same with Turkey. It has good relation with Turkey.
Professor Chomsky, here's a question. What about the European industrial system based on Germany?
Surely going to want to take advantage of this. And it's a lead into the enormous Chinese market and investment area. And Japan, which is technically part of the Atlanticist system, is nevertheless keeping its doors open with China and Russia. It's moving forward with development projects, investment projects in the Far East, fossil fuel investment, other kinds of investment in China as well. So these systems are developing outside the power of the United States to control them. We get to the fragility. So take something concrete. One of the leading Chinese technological major growth centers was the Huawei Technological Center, producing high quality iPhones, 5G communications, and so on. U.S. was committed to destroy it. It has prevented it from receiving the components it needs for its advanced, and the software it needs for its advanced technology, which practically crushed it. It's been pressing hard to get other countries to refuse Huawei technology, with only partial success. Brazil, for example, which has been under a highly authoritarian neo-fascist government very closely linked to the United States. For the president, Bolsonaro, Trump is his hero. And for a while, he went along with U.S. demands not to use Huawei equipment, but even he has shifted from that and is beginning to turn towards them. So the effort to try to block technological progress is a very difficult one. In fact, China's found ways to get around it, if by setting up, I think, hundreds, maybe 1,000 technological schools in various parts of South Asia, Africa, where they teach Chinese technology. That means that the engineers trained there will be ready to use the technology that China can provide. The United States can't stop that with missiles. That's, in fact, the way the United States is reacting is quite important to look at. Under the Biden administration, which has expanded Trump's policies, China is to be, the official term is, China is to be encircled by sentinel states, which are heavily armed with precision weapons provided by the United States aimed at China. That's a ring, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, trying to bring in India, which partially takes part, but keeping its options open as one of the elements of encircling China is enormous naval exercises, RIMPAC they're called, Rim of the Pacific, enormous U.S. organized naval exercises plainly aimed at China. India participates, but it also participates in Russia-China naval military operations, basically keeping its options open. You have to be very careful reading the Western press on this, because there's a lot of outright deceit. A very clear example has to do with India, which is pretty much at the center of a lot of this. The U.S. has been pressing very hard for India to join with it in isolating from Russia and supporting the sanctions regime. Well, there was a meeting in Samarkand a couple of weeks ago where Putin and Prime Minister Modi of India met. The US and European press have made a major effort to show that Modi broke with Russia at that meeting. Take a look closely They seize upon 6 words. When they met, Modi's first words were to Putin were, "War is not the answer." This has been highlighted all over the Western press. It's a total fraud. Take the trouble to look up the Indian government website. Takes 2 minutes. Modi was giving practically a love letter to Putin. He starts by saying, "War is not the answer. Let's move together to peace. We'll maintain our traditionally warm relations. We'll even improve them. They're unbreakable," and so on. All of that is censored out of Western commentary. Literally. I mean, Indian commentators have noted it, but try to find a word in the West outside of people on the margins, like I write about it, a couple of others. And this is one indication of how you have to be very careful at reading commentary and discussion in a world of intensive indoctrination and propaganda. A lot of things you have to be very cautious about. Well, this is a striking example. There are others. Take the sabotage on the Nord Stream pipeline. It's pretty serious. Major operation. These are very well protected pipelines, very well constructed, extremely hard to damage. These are major sabotage operations. That's now conceded. Immediately, the Western commentary says Russia must have done it. Is that likely? This is a Russian pipeline. If they don't want it to run, all they have to do is turn off the spigot. They don't have to sabotage it. They have absolutely no interest in sabotaging it. It's in their interest to keep control of it and keep it running. So we don't know, but it seems extremely unlikely that Russia would be involved in shooting itself in the foot and destroying one of its major economic installations, losing tons of money from the gas that's lost. Why Russia? Well, who has the capability and the motive to destroy it? Think it through. Only one country, the United States, maybe in cooperation with its Polish ally. In fact, the United States just had pretty much controls the Baltic region where the pipelines are. Just had enormous naval operations with its biggest warship in the US fleet, right at the point where the pipelines are, easily capable of sending an underwater unmanned vehicle which could have carried out the sabotage. In fact, it's hard to think of any alternative to this. Well, this is now being discussed by commentators, actually pretty well-regarded commentators, even in the United States, but it's not reaching mainstream discussion. But can you even think of an alternative? Well, if this turns out to be, there will be an investigation, maybe by Sweden, Denmark, other countries that are in immediate control of the region. It's in the Swedish economic zone. Will they be honest investigations? Will we ever get any results from them in less than, say, 20 years? I don't know. But these are ongoing developments right now of major significance. Cyprus is one, Nord Stream's another, Chinese investment in Hungary is another. Meetings take something else of significance. I'm sure you followed the Budapest meeting a month or so ago. It was a gathering in Budapest of the far-right parties in Europe and the other far-right organizations, many with neo-fascist origins, was in Budapest because Viktor Orban is the hero of the far right. His basically seriously undermined Hungarian democracy, turned it into what he calls an illiberal democracy, which is a non-democracy, virtually total control, almost total control of the press, universities, speech, cultural events, political parties neutralized, all committed to a kind of far-right Christian nationalism, a little bit like Modi's ethnocentric Hinduism, which is also undermining Indian secular democracy, similar to things that are happening in Turkey.
Who is the star at the meeting? Who was behind it?
The core of the Republican Party, Conservative Political Action Caucus, were the main feted group participating in the Budapest conference. Couple weeks after that, they themselves organized a conference in Dallas, Texas, at which the keynote speaker was Viktor Orban. He's the sign of the future. Christian, a right-wing Christian nationalist, racist, proto-fascist, authoritarian structures. This is the United States. It's not a small country. It's the world dominant power. In a couple of weeks, the party that organized these, the Republican Party, may take control of Congress. They already control the far-right Supreme Court, and it's not unlikely that they'll come back to the executive. They're working very hard to undermine democratic procedures so that they can arrange to keep themselves in power as a minority party. That's the openly stated goal. It's not even hidden. The Supreme Court is taking up cases in its next term, beginning right now, which may very well enhance these possibilities by undercutting procedures for democratic participation. Well, all of this is also taking place in the world. These are major developments.
Professor Chomsky, is there any relation between Budapest meeting and Abraham Accord?
The Abraham Accords actually fit into this very well. The Abraham Accords are an effort to create an alliance of the most reactionary, repressive states in the region. Israel's part provides the muscle, technology, military capacity, and so on. Saudi Arabia is not technically a part, but that's just a technicality. Saudi Arabian pressure compelled Bahrain to join, also compelled Sudan to join. Egypt, though not technically a partner, is part of it. Most repressive dictatorship in Egypt's history, favorite of Donald Trump, called al-Sisi his favorite dictator, 60,000 political prisoners in jail. Meanwhile, UAE is formally a part of it. And interestingly, the UAE is also a crucial part of China's maritime Silk Road. As I say, hands are reaching in both directions. And that's even true of Israel, the super client state of the United States. China owns half of the Haifa port. And the United States doesn't like that at all, and that's a U.S. naval base. China is bidding to own the whole port. And they would win the bid if it was fair, but Israel's blocking it under U.S. pressure. China's running rail lines in Israel. I mean, this is expanding all over in very complex and intricate ways.
Actually, Abraham Accord includes Morocco as well. My question is, why Morocco?
Why Morocco? Well, Morocco controls, nearly monopolizes phosphate. That's a major, irreplaceable mineral, extraordinarily important for agriculture. And to enhance Morocco's control of it, President Trump departed from the entire international community and recognized Morocco's illegal annexation of Western Sahara, which also has major phosphate deposits. That's alongside of Trump's illegal recognition of Israel's illegal annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights and of the Greater Jerusalem, vast area, including the Old Jerusalem, in violation of unanimous Security Council orders, in violation of international law. U.S. just plunges ahead and does what it wants. Well, that's the Abraham Accords, an alliance of extremely reactionary, harsh, repressive states, fitting into the broader picture of a global reactionary alliance with complicated elements. Like on the one hand, it wants to incorporate Modi's India. It's a natural partner as Modi is destroying Indian secular democracy. On the other hand, India is keeping a foot in the other camp, part of the global South, refusing to take part in the West's war in Ukraine. Same with UAE, subordinate to the United States, but part of the Maritime Silk Road, crucial part, in fact. Well, these are things that are developing in the complex world scene.
Professor Chomsky, actually, there is a very important questions here. Is there any democracy in Afghanistan after the withdrawal? And what is your opinion about these expressions, human rights, credibility, and democracy? Can you talk to that, please?
The idea that they were trying to establish democracy is just a joke. That's, Hitler said the same thing when he took over the Sudetenland. You don't pay attention to that kind of rhetoric. They wanted the idea that they needed Afghans' resources is ridiculous. They could have easily negotiated a pipeline or mineral development with the Taliban if they wanted to. In fact, they were moving in that direction before 9/11. It was just an act of violence to show that you better be careful anywhere in the world. You try anything with us, we'll smash you up. Well, after 20 years of smashing Afghanistan, finally figured enough, not getting anything out of it. The withdrawal was planned by Trump, and it was just a total sellout of the limited Afghan democratic forces that had developed. I mean, if they wanted to be serious, they would have announced, well, we're going to get out. Meanwhile, you find ways of accommodating. We'll stay here while you make local arrangements, try to get settled, see if you can prepare for a more or less peaceful future, which could have happened. Could have been local accommodations all over. It's basically a country of warlords and rural villages. So all sorts of opportunities for local accommodations. Instead of doing that, Trump just said, we'll pull out. The only condition is to the Taliban, don't shoot at our troops. That's it, nothing else. Biden softened it up a little, but not enough. So, of course, when the U.S. forces withdrew, everything totally collapsed. The U.S. intelligence apparently hadn't a clue about what was happening. They were totally surprised. It was quite obvious that this was going to happen. It was obvious to anybody who was looking. Afghan government was totally corrupt. Half the Afghan army was ghost soldiers. They weren't even there. Commanders collecting money and listing names that weren't there. So, of course, the whole thing was a hollow shell. Actually, it's very much like what happened in Iraq right before it. U.S. spent enormous amounts of money training a huge Iraqi army, heavily armed, well-trained, top-flight training. As soon as a couple of jihadis came racing towards them in pickup trucks, waving rifles, the officers fled, the soldiers fled, the whole huge army collapsed. This is ISIS. It could have taken Baghdad if the Shiite militias backed by Iran hadn't blocked them. I mean, a foreign occupying power can't create a loyal army. I mean, that's just not going to happen. Apparently, American intelligence couldn't understand this. And so it was a disaster when they withdrew. Traditional imperial powers understood these things. I should say the United States has been learning lessons about imperialism that Britain and France already knew from centuries of experience. Like one major lesson from Vietnam is you cannot fight a brutal, vicious colonial war with draftees. You can't pick up young men off the streets and say, go slaughter women and children. They're not up to it. So what happened in Vietnam is the U.S. Army rebelled. Soldiers stopped following orders. They were taking drugs. Finally, the Army wanted to remove the whole Army because the Army was falling apart. Since then, the United States has been following the British-French policy, use mercenaries, French Foreign Legion, Gurkhas. United States, they call the mercenaries contractors. But if you look at who's doing the dirty work on the ground, a lot of it is contractors. That plus warfare from the skies, drones, should kill people from a distance. So you don't have to have draftees breaking into villages and smashing up the place and killing people. They're not up to that. These are lessons that imperial powers have to come to understand. The U.S. has now learned it. It's fighting different kinds of wars.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chomsky, for your important information. Let's talk about the credibility, if there is any, in the politics world. Did the withdrawal shake credibility of the United States with its allies, especially in the Middle East and Gulf region? Is it the beginning of the multipolar world, as President Putin recently stated?
Well, Putin, of course, is in favor of a multipolar world. So is China. So is the global South. It's not Putin particularly. They're all pressing for a multipolar world which will not be unilaterally dominated. Is it moving in that direction? Partly, partly not. The U.S. is working hard to impede it. Putin's invasion of Ukraine, one of its effects was to seriously undermine a multipolar world in perfectly obvious ways. Why? Europe could have, in fact, Europe was, before the invasion, Emmanuel Macron, the most significant statesman in Europe, was trying very hard to reach some sort of accommodation with Putin over Ukraine, which would have avoided the war altogether. We actually have the transcripts, the full transcripts of the Putin-Macron discussions up to 4 days before the war. Macron was making quite serious proposals which could have prevented the war. Putin was basically not paying attention. At the end, 4 days before the invasion, what Putin said is, sorry, I don't have time for this. I have to go ice skating. Those are his words. Dismissed it with total contempt. Then went on and invaded Ukraine. Russian intelligence, obviously, agreed with American intelligence. They thought they could conquer Kiev in a couple of days, just as American intelligence did. Turned out not. Greatly overestimated the strength of the Russian military, completely underestimated the capacity of Ukraine, their courage and commitment to resistance. It was a disaster in the northern invasion. Then you changed tactics, moved back to the east, to the Donbass, Kherson region. But right up to the invasion, Putin had the opportunity to accept the hand that was offered, to avoid the invasion, to move towards settlement of the Ukraine conflict on the essential terms that Russia had demanded way back to the 1990s. Core element is neutralization of Ukraine. That could have been achieved. In fact, Zelensky himself proposed that as recently as last March, even after the invasion. And so neutralization of Ukraine and some kind of settlement for the Donbass region in the basic terms of the Minsk agreements could have been possible. It would have been a federal Ukraine, something like Switzerland, Belgium, neutral Ukraine like Austria during the whole Cold War, like Mexico today, a possible settlement. Putin turned it down. The United States was strongly opposed to it, remains opposed, but it's a possibility. Is it still a possibility? Basically, don't know. So going back to your question, there's basically no issue of credibility. It's not what's the term credibility means fear. Credibility of the United States means I'm afraid of the United States. Term credibility is a diplomatic evasion. So let's use words the way they're meant. So does the United States have credibility in Europe? Yeah, Europe's terrified of the United States. So it follows US orders even if it doesn't like it. That's called credibility. So Europe, for example, is strongly opposed to the US sanctions on Iran, but it obeys them. The whole world is opposed to US sanctions on Cuba, fiercest sanctions ever imposed. And take a look at a vote in the United Nations, 184-2, US and Israel. Israel has to vote with the US. So basically the United States versus the world. Every single country observes the sanctions. That's US credibility, meaning you better do what we say or you smash you in the face. It's called credibility in diplomatic circles. So did US credibility decline? No, not at all. US still has the same power, the same means of violence and control. In the Middle East and Gulf region, it's, as I said, moving in a complicated direction. Abraham Accords are a far-right reactionary alliance under US control, but the members of it have their own goals. Saudi Arabia moving towards various accommodations with Iran. UAE, part of the Maritime Silk Road. They're all playing their own game while being part of the US-dominated system. Could be a move towards a multipolar world. That's a conflict. The United States is trying to impose a unilateral world. It's interesting to see how this plays out in the doctrinal realm, scholarship, commentary, and so on. There's a conflict between what's called a rule-based international order and a UN-based international order. It's a very interesting distinction. In the United States, Britain, most of Europe, you're supposed to say we want a rule-based international order. In China, Russia, India, they say, no, we want a UN-based international order. There's a crucial distinction between them. Who sets the rules? In a rule-based international order, Washington sets the rules. That's the Atlanticist NATO vision. If you're an American scholar, you have to repeat those words. Deeply indoctrinated country, people follow the rules. So you have to say we're in favor of a rule-based international order. We can't be in favor of a UN-based international order because the UN Charter, the basis of modern international law, determines that virtually all US policy is illegal. So obviously we can't be in favor of that. You bother to read the UN Charter, get as far as Article 2. It bans the threat or use of force in international affairs. Bans all of US foreign policy. Threat or use of force. That's the whole foreign policy. Well, obviously, a well-disciplined American scholar can't say, I'm in favor of banning all of US foreign policy. So therefore, we favor a rule-based order where we set the rules and Europe and the rest follow what we say out of credibility, meaning we're frightened of you. That's the actual world in which we live, not the world that's discussed rhetorically.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. Quite interesting topics and information today. How do you see, back to Russia and Putin, how do you see the Russian-Ukraine war, and do you expect a nuclear war? Do you think Putin is using the brinkmanship policy? Do you think that Ukraine war is a war of attrition?
Well, actually, nobody knows, but anybody who's sane will try to do anything we can to avoid a nuclear war. If it leads to a nuclear war, we're finished. There is no such thing as a nuclear war between major nuclear powers. It destroys everything. The attacker is destroyed just by the effects of nuclear winter. It's not an option. Eisenhower understood this. Reagan understood it. It's Kennedy, everybody understood it until the present. Now there's a lot of talk about nuclear war just by people who are out of their minds. They're not looking at the elementary facts about nuclear war. The same is true of tactical nuclear weapons, which are not so small, incidentally. If you use tactical nuclear weapons, there's going to be a response. You move up the escalation ladder, it's pretty hard to stop. Remember that the risk is total annihilation. The Second World War was bad enough, but this is beyond it by orders of magnitude. It's not that everybody will be killed, of course. There'll be stragglers around. Actually, Einstein had a sensible comment on this once. He was asked, what kind of weapons would he think would be used in a Third World War? His answer was, he didn't know what kind of weapons would be used in a Third World War, but he knew what kind would be used in a Fourth War, stone axes. Well, that's the answer. You just can't talk about these things. And there's a lot of talk about tactical nuclear weapons. They're basically missing the point. You take a look at US, British strategists. they are very surprised by the kind of war that Russia fought in Ukraine. They expected a war of the kind that the US and Britain fight. When the US and Britain go to war, it's not half measures. They go right for the jugular, destroy the communication system, destroy transportation, destroy the energy system immediately, first couple days, prevent the society from functioning. That's why they thought that the war would be over in 3 days. That's why they were planning a provisional government in exile for Ukraine after they took Zelensky out by helicopter. They were very deeply surprised by this. They know that Russia has conventional weapons, forget tactical weapons, has conventional weapons which could devastate Ukraine. Ukrainian military command also knows this. They've pointed it out, in fact. I've quoted them in articles saying, of course, Russia has missiles which could devastate Ukraine. Well, they haven't used them. You go to Kiev, there are foreign reporters in Kiev reporting from there. They say life is pretty normal. It's not at peace. It's not like Paris, but everything's basically functioning. People are going to concerts, restaurants, and so on. That's not a British-US style of war. They make sure that it's smashed right away. Well, Russia could move on to do this. Why they're not? You can guess as well as I can, but they certainly can. Now, if Russia is ever facing defeat, it's not at all clear that that will ever happen, but just imagine. Suppose they are. Well, they have two choices. Putin could pack up his bags and say, okay, I'm leaving. We accept complete defeat. I go back home to be thrown out, sent to a prison camp, totally discredited. It's one choice. The other choice is I'll use the conventional weapons that I have to devastate Ukraine. It's another choice. Now you take a look at the position of the West, US and Britain, this means. The rest of Europe is ambivalent. US and Britain are saying, let's gamble. Let's gamble that with our aid, Ukraine can defeat Russia. And then we're gambling that Putin will do what I say, just said. Okay, I accept defeat. I'll go home to be destroyed. And he won't do what he can do. Uses conventional weapons to fight a US-British type war. It's an incredible gamble with the fate of Ukrainians. And in fact, the world giving all that's at stake here. But that happens to be official US-British policy. Official US policy is continue to fight the war to weaken Russia, not to liberate Ukraine, to weaken Russia severely. That's the goal of the war, meaning impose the Atlanticist system in which Europe is a satellite of the United States. It's basically what it spells out in the real world. It's an amazing situation. It has precedence. Take a look back at the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. We now have a tremendous amount of information about that. The Russian archives are available. There's a definitive study of the Russian withdrawal by Diego Cordovez, the UN official who carried it out, along with Zelig Harrison, a leading US specialist in the region. We know all about it. What happened is, to take the Cordovez-Harrison words, the US was committed to fight the Afghan war to the last Afghan. The US worked hard to maintain the war. The Russians wanted to withdraw. They had no military defeat. They were perfectly good military control. They didn't see any point of it. They wanted to get out. US wanted them to stay in, armed radical Islamists to try to keep them in, tried hard to undermine the negotiations. Again, in their words, to fight the Russians to the last Afghan. Well, unfortunately, that's similar to what it's beginning to look like in Ukraine. And in fact, Western commentators are beginning to point it out, some high-placed ones, so they don't make the newspapers. But take John Quigley. He was the U.S. State Department representative to the OSCE, the European-based meetings right after the fall of the Soviet Union to try to organize policies with regard to the remnants. He was the person, the U.S. representative, in charge of the Crimea, Donbass parts of the negotiations, been following it closely since, right at the center of power. His words recently, I'll quote them, "It's harder and harder to avoid the conclusion that the U.S. is trying to fight in Ukraine, to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian." That's John Quigley, one of the leading figures in the American diplomatic corps, Ambassador Chas Freeman, former ambassador of Saudi Arabia to China, a distinguished figure, said the same thing. These people are being bitterly denounced, but are they wrong?
Professor Chomsky, President Biden said that the USA is committed to a deeper defense of Taiwan. Does it mean strategic ambiguity has now turned to strategic certainty? And does it give the Taiwan government some claws and teeth?
What it gives the Taiwan government is an opportunity to be destroyed. That's exactly what it means. There has been, as you said, a policy of strategic ambiguity. Let's spell that out a little. Since the 1970s, the United States has agreed that Taiwan is part of China. No question. That's been settled for over 50 years. There has been what's called strategic ambiguity, meaning both sides tacitly agree that they won't do anything to disrupt by force, to disrupt this relation. That's the tacit agreement. It's kept the peace for 50 years. Not bad in world affairs. The U.S. is now disrupting it. It wants to disrupt that. The encirclement of China, all of the things I described are part of the ways of disrupting it. With Taiwan specifically, important things are happening which are barely being reported. Give you the most important of them. September 14th, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but with a bipartisan vote, Democrats and Republicans, voted to pass a Taiwan Policy Act. It isn't yet legislation. It's a Senate Foreign Relations Committee legislative proposal. That's worth reading carefully. It calls for sharply increasing advanced military sales to Taiwan aimed at China, military exercises jointly with the United States and Taiwan, moving towards interoperability of military systems, turning Taiwan into what it calls a non-NATO ally. a de facto NATO member in effect, calls for treating Taiwan diplomatically as a sovereign country on a par with all other sovereign countries, eliminating any restrictions on diplomatic connections. This is almost a declaration of war. China isn't reacting yet, but I assume that it will. Well, that's, to use your terms, that's turning strategic ambiguity to strategic certainty. Does it give Taiwan clause? No. Makes Taiwan a target for Chinese invasion. Of course, China could invade. If the United States tried to go to war, it would probably lead to a global war that kills us all. So it could happen. But from the point of view of the Taiwanese people, it's a disaster. And in fact, if you look closely, the Taiwan Policy Act follows very closely the model of US policies towards Ukraine in the last decade, systematically moving to integrate Ukraine within the NATO military command, step by step. Under Biden, it moved forward last September 21, to a year ago in September, to an enhanced program for moving towards entry into NATO. That's right before the invasion. Well, they're following a similar model with regard to Taiwan, where strategic ambiguity has kept the peace for over half a century. This is all part of what we call the withdrawal. The withdrawal is accompanied by strengthening of efforts to establish hegemony, threatening war over and over. It's a very ominous situation.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. I'm deeply appreciative. Before to ask you the last word to our channel, as our meeting is coming to an end, we want to thank you, Professor Chomsky, for your generosity in time and in knowledge. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Your humility should be taken as an example. Thank you.
Pretty simple. Face the world honestly, with an open mind, critical mind. When you hear words like credibility, human rights, democracy promotion, ask yourself what they mean in practice. You can do that. Then you can look at the world openly, honestly, find a way forward to a much better future.
شكرا جزيلا لكم أعزائي المتابعين والمشاهدين. هنا دائما وأبدا حمزة الكناني، لإثراء العقل لا إثارة العاطفة.